So this week I thought I would do a video on Corey Henry's solo on the Snarky Puppy song, Lingus. In particular, I want to try and answer a question which appears in David Bruce's video on the solo.
And as a solo, it clearly leaves a lot of people in a state of some confusion. How can you play such seemingly random shit that's all over the place over a poppy E minor progression without it sounding weird? I need explanation on that.
So unsurprisingly, David Bruce does a fantastic job of analyzing this solo as a whole. Having said that, because his video aims to analyze the entire solo, I don't find that he answers this question with as satisfying a level of detail as I would have liked. So with that in mind, I took the opposite tact and analyzed a small portion of the solo in great detail. In this video, I'm going to share with you 3 techniques which I found in this fragment which allow Henry to, in the words of Rabid Miguel, play seemingly random stuff over a poppy E minor progression. This is how Corey Henry reharmonizes a melody. A problem with writing random sounding harmony is that your listener can sometimes feel lost. So one way Henry counteracts this tendency is by putting a lot of simple tonal material in the upper voices of his chords. For instance, if we remove everything but the top note of each chord in this solo, then what remains is a simple tonal melody which sounds like this. I say this melody is simple because all but 2 of the notes come from the G major 7 arpeggio, and I say it's tonal because all the notes come from the key of G major. Similarly, most of the chords in the treble clef are either root position 7th chords or first inversions of simple triads that are diatonic to the key of G major. In fact, the progression is surprisingly close to being a textbook example of functional harmony in the key of G major. Note the frequent use of tonic and dominant chords. If the goal of the right hand is to make the listener feel grounded and comfortable, then the goal of the left hand is to create the dissonance and chromaticism that we associate with this progression as a whole. Corey accomplishes this through 2 techniques. First, note how most of the notes in the left hand are not part of the chords implied by the right hand. Rather, the left hand is playing tension notes. Voicing your chords so that the tension notes are in the lowest voices is a surefire way to make the identity of the chords very unclear. This becomes truer and truer the more tensions you have in the chord. For instance, compare this common root position voicing of a C6-9 chord to this inversion, which places the 9th in the bass. The second chord seems much more like an A minor 7 over D or even some sort of like D9 than it does a C6-9. Another way that Henry introduces dissonance with the right hand is through his use of fourths. Check out how the left hand only plays perfect fourth, sharp fourths, tritones, or fifths, which are basically just fourths in inversion. This creates a sense of ambiguity and tension for 2 reasons. One, it leads to several chordal chords, that is, chords made out of fourths instead of thirds, as well as several chords that have chordal voicings, that is, chords that are made up of mainly of fourths, but also include other intervals. Second, it leads to many chords with tritones in the lowest register, which is arguably the most dissonant or jarring register to place a dissonant interval like a tritone. For instance, compare these 2 voicings of a C7 chord. The latter definitely has a lot more crunch to it. Now, before moving on to the 3rd technique, which applies more to the rhythm section, let's look at how we can apply the analysis we've done so far to a progression of our own. So the first thing we'll need is a melody. How about the melody, the Ode to Joy? Next, add the simplest, most functional chord progression to it that you can. Try and include plenty of dominant tonic relationships to leave room for jazzy extensions later on. Next, I recommend adding tensions to the chords. You may even want to use some secondary dominance or modal borrowing as a means to introduce more chromaticism to the progression as a whole. Finally, alter these chords so that the tension notes are in the lower registers and make sure that the 2 lowest voices form parallel fourths, tritones, or fifths. As an additional step, I recommend playing around a bit with these harmonies and adding passing chords. That is, chords that kind of work more through voice leading than anything else. And voila, there you go. You got yourself a Corey Henry progression. So as much as I think this example captures the harmony of Lingus pretty well, it still doesn't quite sound like the solo overall. Something is missing. As I mentioned earlier, the material in the right hand or treble clef strongly implies the key of G major. The rhythm section, on the other hand, strongly implies the key of E minor, or E Phrygian if you want to see the flat 2 as part of the scale and not just as an instance of modal borrowing. What this means is that the upper structure of Henry's chords form something of a polytonal or polymodal relationship with the rhythm section's bass. In other words, this section sort of implies 2 keys at once. So no wonder it has that sort of random sound to it. As with his use of harmony, however, Henry's use of polytonality/polymodality is restrained and balanced. You see, the relative dissonance of a polytonal relationship is proportionate to the number of notes the scales share in common. The 2 scales we're dealing with here, G major over E minor, or even E Phrygian, share most of their notes in common, so the sense of dissonance/weirdness is very mild, but still palpable. A good deal of what makes this solo sound random comes from Henry's use of rhythm. For example, note how after the pickup, Henry never plays the same rhythm twice in a row. So for example, we go from a quarter note to a half note plus an eighth note, then just to a half note, then back to a quarter note, and on and on. This creates a sense of rhythmic irregularity. It makes his playing feel spontaneous and hard to predict. Finally, Henry starts his solo in an unaccented section of the chord loop, which creates a hyperbeat syncopation. For the purposes of this discussion, I'm going to forego explaining what hyperbeats are, and instead just say we'd expect Henry to start his solo on the first beat of bar 5, but instead he starts it in the middle of the bar. This results in the whole progression having a sort of off-kilter, wonky relationship to the rhythm section. Okay, enough talk. How do we compose with this? Start by choosing 2 contrasting keys or modes. I recommend starting off with a relatively consonant polytonal relationship like E Phrygian over G major, or vice versa. Next, write a bass line. Since you're going to be adding a melody line in a different key or mode, you want to make sure that the bass strongly implies the key you chose. Let's have a listen. Next, you'll need to write a simple lyrical melody in the contrasting key you chose. Make sure this melody primarily consists in notes from the tonic triad of this key or strongly implies the key in some other way. Here's the melody I wrote. Next, introduce syncopations in one of the ways we discussed before. Interestingly, the melody I wrote is in a completely different tempo than my bass line. This actually works out pretty well because we want our melody to have a good degree of rhythmic freedom from the rhythm section. So all I really had to do to get this effect was transpose this melody into the same tempo as the rhythm section and then change a few notes here and there to make sure the line sounded right to my ears. Finally, use the harmonic approach I discussed in the reharmonization section to generate chords for each note in the melody. Boom, there you go. You've got a Corey Henry Lingus style chord progression that can work great as a nice, unexpected lead-in to a solo. Check it out. If you want to support this channel, then please comment, like, share, and subscribe. Additionally, if you are interested in transcriptions from this video or other perks related to the content I create here, then head on over to my Patreon. The link is in the video's description. Thanks.